Okay, hello everybody. It's 1 p.m. Eastern Time, so we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us online. It's wonderful to see you or to have you here, although I'm not seeing you. If you wouldn't mind, a lot of you have already told us you can hear us, but for those of you who are just logging on, if you can locate the GoToWebinar control panel, which it's shown in the lower right-hand side of my screen, but on your computer, it's probably somewhere on the right-hand side, just where it says enter question for staff. That is where you will enter in a question for staff during the course of the webinar. So if you have a question about what we're talking about, just type it in and either I will try to address it during the course of the webinar today. If the question is a little bit off topic or more in depth, you will get a reply via the chat window from my colleague, Rafael Gomez Amaro. And also we can follow up with you offline via email because we have everybody's email. But definitely participate that way. It makes for a more interesting experience for everybody. And you know, if you are having trouble hearing the audio, you can always call in via telephone. You know, a lot of folks are having internet issues these days due to increased bandwidth. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So what are we going to talk about today? So today's webinar is about advanced batch processing plus panels. So last week we did a getting started in FCS Express webinar where we did set up a basic batch process, and I'll be doing that again with you today. I'm not going to set up the layout because that's something we covered in getting started, but I will use a layout that's already set up to review setting up a basic batch process. And here's the outline of everything we're going to cover. So we're going to, you know, even before we set up the batch process, we're going to try to understand what is the concept of iterations. So that ties into both a basic batch process, but it's especially important to understand when you're setting up a more complex batch process, which I'll get to in a minute. Okay, secondly, after we set up this basic batch process, which will summarize the results from all the data files in your experiment to these formats, PowerPoint, PDF, and Excel. You can also send it directly out to your printer. I'll show you that too. I'm also going to show you how you can adjust the gates for each iteration, or in the simple case, each iteration would mean each FCS data file. So you can have separate gating positions for each, although the default in FCS Express is for your gating positions to be global. And then we're going to try to look at a couple of more complex examples for the batch process. That's my third bullet point here. And the first one, it's not all that complex, but it's one that comes up quite often. So I'd like to show it to you because I don't think we normally cover that in our getting started webinar, although we do a basic batch process then. And that is the case of adding a control overlay to your histogram. So a lot of times you have some sort of positive control or an isotype control, or even if it's just not a control per se, but some sort of reference sample that you want to kind of judge the rest of your samples against. And so you want that to be an your histogram that is stationary as the other overlay changes to the experimental sample of interest. So I'm going to show you how to handle that situation. It's really quite easy. And then lastly, I'm going to show you how to use panels. So panels are a feature that will allow you to batch process more than one FCS data file per iteration. So an example of that is, let's say you're acquiring data files from 20 mice. If you just had one FCS data file from each of the 20 mice, you would do a basic batch process. But if you have a more complex situation, where let's say each mouse you collected 3 different tubes from, like you had a spleen tube, a blood tube, and a lymph node tube, you know, then you would have 3 files per iteration because you're trying to bash through all your data files on a mouse by mouse basis, but you have 3 files per mouse because you have the 3 different tissues. So that's an example where it would be a panel that contains the 3 tubes, i.e. the 3 different tissues, and you would batch through all of those on a 3x3 basis, okay? Another example, which is the one I'm actually going to show you the layout of, is this example. I have a little screenshot of it here. that I've circled in yellow. And this is the type of panel we're going to set up as an example where we're judging different antibody staining. And so we have the experimental tube, the experimental FCS file tube, which would be the sample. And then we have two reference tubes, an isotype and a control. And the reason you would use panels here is you have multiple instances of these three files. So maybe you have, you know, several different sample antibodies you want to test, and they all have their own isotype or control, something like that. Okay, so panels are really useful for that, and they're also useful for automatically loading up in the template layout with the three files all going to the correct plots that you intended. So it's very good for when you're going to be repeating the same analysis over and over again on a more complex batch process logic. Okay, so I know this sounds a little bit abstract right now, and that's okay. I'm doing my best to explain it in words, but I think it'll be more clear to you once I actually start setting it up with you with live layouts, and that's what we're going to do today. So as I progress, again, you know, please, for those of you who are logging in just a couple of minutes late, if you have any questions on the GoToWebinar control panel, which I've pictured here on the lower right-hand side of my screen, where it says enter a question in for staff, that's where you can type in your questions and either Raphael or I will get back to you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's do this first part here. Let's try to understand the concept of iterations, because that's what all of these other things that we're going to cover are based on. Okay, so let me come to a very simple layout. This is a simple layout where we're looking at one FCS data file at a time. So these three plots here, they are all showing the first data file in my data list. Okay, and you know what? Let me start from the very beginning. Maybe you folks don't remember how to get to the data list. That's going to be here on your data tab. So just go to the data tab, click on data list. You know, we have the ribbons and tabs interface. Everything is fairly intuitive to find, I think. Okay, so we have a number of data files that we want to process here. And like I said, I'm not going to go through any details on how to set up the plots and the gates and the statistics, because that's something that was covered in the Getting Started webinar. But as I click through Next, Previous up here on the Data tab, we can do a preview of what our batch process will be processing, right? So now I'm advancing stepwise through my data files in the data list. You see that the active file that's showing in the layout is highlighted in turquoise on the data list, right? So now I'm on file 7. I click next, I'm on file 8. I can click previous a bunch of times to get back to the beginning, or I can, you know, on any of these blue numbers to get back, or I can use this drop-down menu here to advance or go back to non-consecutive iterations. But what I want to talk about right now, before we even set up the batch process together, is what is an iteration? So an iteration is basically the step that the batch process takes. And in this case, we have one FCS file per iteration. So what that means is when I click next, every object on my layout, so whoops, didn't mean to duplicate that, sorry. Every object on my layout, so these three plots right here, whoops. The three plots, the density plot, the color dot plot, and the histogram down here, as well as these statistics windows, which refer to statistics within those gated populations. Those are all objects. So all of these objects are going to advance stepwise to the next iteration in the data list. So it's basically, an iteration is what the layout advances to when you click next. And in our case, each of these three objects, the three plots, they're advancing to the next iteration, which in our case is the next data file. So like I said, this is the most simple example of a batch process where you're just processing all 9 samples, you know, one by one. And as I click next, the data is advancing into each of those plots simultaneously. Okay. So let's set up a batch process for this simple example of a layout, and then I'll show you a slightly more complex example. But the other thing I want to show you when we do this batch process, like I mentioned, if I just quickly go back to my my summary screen, my outline screen rather. We're going to set up the batch process, but I'm also going to show you how to adjust the gates for each iteration. Okay, so let's first just run the batch process, and then I'll show you how you can come back and adjust the gates for each iteration. And there's different ways to do that in FCS Express. So somebody asked, is there a way to display all 9 FCS files together rather than moving back and forth? There is, but we're not going to be covering that today because the purpose of today's webinar is actually, whoops, jumping the gun here, is actually to show you how to do a batch process because it's a lot more efficient than just putting them all into the layout. There is a way that you can kind of batch within the layout. So if I have time, I'll get to that at the end, but it's not really what we're focusing on for today. But we can also send you a manual link for that. Okay, so let's set up a batch process. So let's go to the batch tab, of course, and we're going to click on batch actions here. These are dockable windows. So as you're moving it around, by dragging it from the top, you can drag it, for instance, on the left here. There's this icon that appears in the middle of your screen when you are dragging that floating window around, and if you mouse over the left or right side, then that window will stay docked on the left, which is nice for making sure your layout's not covered up. I can even grab my data list and put it inside. I'm going to dock it inside the batch window here. Whoops. There we go. So that's useful if you're working with a small laptop screen like I am today. Okay, so let's set up a batch process. First, I'm going to click on print here and click OK. So this is useful if you just want a quick printout for your lab notebook. You don't even necessarily have to make a PDF or a PowerPoint in that case, if that's all you want. I'm going to uncheck that though, because I don't really want that to print out to my printer, but I just want you to know it's there. Let's do a save to PowerPoint. And I can click this here to make sure that the PowerPoint file opens automatically and I don't have to hunt it down after I run the batch process. And now I can scroll down to the bottom here. I know this is a big window. For the most part, you don't have to worry about these options. You can just click here on the little yellow folder and set up your file name and save path. So I will call this batch webinar. Okay, let's set up a PDF. Okay, when you're doing a PDF, by default, it's going to try to save one separate PDF for each data file, but I think in most cases you want to combine all of the data files into one big PDF file. So if that's the case, you want to click this second radio button here under iteration options. Oh, it's not going to let me circle it. I'm sorry. So sometimes my drawing tools don't work here on the Mac, but it's this second button right here that waving my mouse pointer around. I don't know if you can see, but it's this one that says combine the output from all iterations into a single file. And then you'll come down here and like before, set up your file name and save paths. Okay, and let's lastly put in an Excel export. So that's down here under add report. So there's two different ones, export to Excel column and export to Excel cell mode. I'm going to do the first one here. And again, let's just set up our file name and path real quick. I'll say OK. All right, so let's do a save of this layout. I always like to save periodically so I don't lose my work. There we go. All right, so we're almost done. We just need to tell FCS Express what statistics we're interested in exporting to Excel. So you can do that via drag and drop. So for instance, if you'd like something from this CD8 gate, just put your cursor inside the gate, within the borders of the gate, and then drag and drop it from that middle of the gate onto the word Excel. If you're doing it right, you'll see your cursor will become a little plus as you drag it onto the word Excel column mode. I know that doesn't come through in the webinar, but if you're doing it on your own computer, you'll see it. And then the software knows you want something based on that CD8 gate, so it's already highlighted that here in this middle box called gate, and you just have to tell the software what you want. So let's do the X geometric mean and the X median and percent of gated cells. And I'm going to select file name here as well. That way the file name will be column A in my Excel export, and I'll know what each iteration is in the export, okay? And as far as selecting these items, these are standard rules for your operating system to multiple select, so you would do a command click on Mac or a control click on PC. Okay, so let's put in a few more statistics. So you can also use these statistics windows here as a source to drag and drop. And let me put in maybe a couple more stats of interest here. Okay, maybe we'll put in number of events. You know, I could take all of these by doing a shift click and drag and drop them onto the Word Excel. So if you had one of these stat windows from, you know, anything else on your layout, like a 2D plot, you could use that too. And then, you know, why don't I grab all of these stats here in my text table as well while I'm at it. Okay, so we're going to have all of these stats come out in our batch process. If you want to reorder any of the stats, and that will affect the order that they come out in your Excel spreadsheet. For instance, maybe I want my sample ID to be column B, so it's next to my file name. I can just drag it here off to the left where there's white space and then let go. And so now I'll have file name being column A and sample ID being column B. Okay, so let's quickly run this batch process. You know, again, when you run the batch process, it's good to do a quick preview through all your samples and see how everything looks, do your gates fit your sample, etc. So let's assume that we're happy with the gates for all of the instances here. Let's go back to sample 1. Okay, and that's another important thing I want to mention. When you run the batch, you want to make sure you're starting on iteration 1. So iteration 1 is turquoise right now because it's the active iteration showing in my plots. Because if you started with another iteration, showing in your layout, then you would only have from that iteration till the end of the data list. So in other words, if I started with 4, I would only have samples 4 through 9 coming out in my PowerPoint, PDF, and Excel. Okay, that's by design. So if you want all of them to come out in your exports, just start on sample 1 by single clicking on that blue number, or using this drop down menu, or clicking previous multiple times till you get back to sample 1. Okay, so let's quickly run this batch. I'm going to go batch run. In this case, you can just ignore this window, just click yes, and this is going to start coming out. And like I said, right after this runs, I'm going to show you the more interesting case, I guess, of adjusting the gates for each sample. And there's a couple different ways to do that. So let's just wait till that comes out. Don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So we're almost done here. So here is my batch process that came out in a PowerPoint. And you see we have 9 slides because we had 9 iterations in our data list and we had 1 page in our layout. If we had had 2 pages in our layout, because you can spread plots from the same sample on as many pages as you want, then we would have had 18 slides, right? Because 9 times 2. But this is a very simple layout. And these are all high resolution, so you can move them around and resize them and they'll still look good. Okay, so let's close that and let's take a look at our Excel file that should be on my desktop. There we go. Okay, so you have 1 file per iteration. And so each iteration is showing here in subsequent rows in the Excel, right? That's probably quite familiar no matter what software you're used to using. And then we have 1 row of data, sorry, 1 column of data for each statistics. In case you're wondering why geometric mean is error here, it's probably because I have some non-positive data points in the CD for gate. So the geometric mean is a mathematical concept. It can only be calculated on positive data sets because it's actually the root of the product of all your values, and you can't take the root of a non-positive number. So Just thought I'd point that out in case that alarmed anyone. So yeah, so you've got one column for every statistic. Okay, so hopefully that's fairly straightforward. And I think we can open up our PowerPoint as well. Let me go to my desktop to find that. Okay, so here's, I'm sorry, our PDF. So here's our PDF, and this is, again, we're having 9 pages in our PDF, and it looks exactly like your layout, right? That's one of the nicest things about FCS Express, is what you see is what you get. So whatever your layout looks like, that's what your visual output in PDF or PowerPoint form is going to look like. The only caveat about using PDFs is the PDF prints the white page exactly as you see it. So if you had a plot that was kind of spilling over the white page like that, then the plot would be cut off on a PDF, but it would still come through fully on your PowerPoint because you get the background objects on PowerPoint. Okay, so I see a question, somebody's asking, why do some iterations become inactive when you're working with FCS Express? So that's a great question, and that's something that we can definitely talk about in the next section. So when I show the example of working with a control overlay, it's going to address your question. Even if that's not what you're trying to do, it will become clear, and I'll show you how to deal with that. Okay, so okay, so let's quickly set this up so we can have different gating positions for each sample. So I think you remember, for those of you who attended our Getting Started webinar last week or other webinars in the past, one way to enable different gating positions is to use this button here, the Apply Iteration Snapshot button, and then you can kind of go through next, previous in your layout and adjust the gates for each sample, and then you would click Batch Rerun, right? That's what I showed last time. So that works. You can do that. You can also use data-specific gates if you want to, if that's something you're already accustomed to doing. But what I'm going to show you now is another way, which I like to do, since this is a webinar about batching, I like to do it this way because this actually allows you to adjust the gates during the batch. So the way to do that is to click here on Batch Options. And it's this checkbox right here. So unconditionally pause between iterations. So what that is going to do is it's going to, rather than exporting all 9 iterations to PowerPoint, PDF, Excel in one fell swoop, it's going to stop on each file or each iteration and let us make those changes. Okay, so let's close this because I won't be able to overwrite the files if they're open, of course. Okay, so let's click Run, and you'll see that it's going to give us a chance to make those changes. So here, you can ignore this in that case and say yes. Okay, so you see it's exported the first sample, or the first iteration, right? So it says 1 out of 9 in the bottom progress bar, 1 out of 9 iterations. In our case, it's 1 out of 9 data files. And the top progress bar says 3 out of 3 actions executed. And that refers to the 3 actions in the batch process queue. And that's the export to PowerPoint, PDF, and Excel. So now we have a chance to adjust our gates, okay? So let's say I want to move my last gate over a little bit like this. And you can just ignore that and say continue. Okay, and maybe I want to make my CD8 gate rounder like that. And I'll also adjust this marker. So markers and quads, you can make those adjustments just like you would gates. And then you have the choice to either keep the changes, okay, or to restore the state of the layout before the next iteration. And so if I were to do the first choice, keep the changes, these gate changes would carry over onto the third iteration, the third data file, okay? If instead I click this second option, restore the state of the layout before the next iteration, and I'm sorry, that text is a little bit cut off on my Mac, then the gates will jump back to what the original position was. Okay, so let's do that second option. I'm gonna click continue now on the window and watch the gate positions. You see they jumped back, right? The CD8 became more oval, the M1 marker jumped back, the blast gate moved back over rightwards, right? So if I'm happy with that, I can say continue. Let me make one change here that's really obvious in iteration 4. I know this doesn't really fit the data, but I just want it to be very clear in the PowerPoint and the PDF that comes out. So I'm just going to make this limp skate very large, okay, just for the purposes of illustration. Then I'm going to click continue. And I think you get the idea now. So, so what I'm going to do is click run to end. Okay, and that's going to just use these gating positions for all the other samples. I see one person had a question about the axes. So that has to do with, if you see the axes min and max jumping around a little, just feel assured that your gate boundaries aren't changing. Your gate is numerically the same, but bi-exponential gating was an algorithm developed by BD, and it does adjust based on the range of your particular data file. Now, there is a way to fix that, so it's stationary between the samples if that bothers you, and so we can send you a manual link to that afterwards. I know that's a question that comes up during batching, but we won't cover it in detail today because it's not about batching per se. But thank you for the question. Somebody asked, is there a difference between data-specific gates and iteration snapshots? You could use data-specific gates during batch processes. That's fine if that's what you're used to using. They'll both function the same way as would iteration snapshots. Okay, data-specific gates was designed for something a little different, and I see Raphael is answering that a little more detail. So thanks, Raphael. Okay, so here is our PowerPoint file, and we'll probably just look at this in the interest of time because I just want to show you that the gating positions came through. So if I go to the second sample or the second slide, you see we have that rounder CD8 gate. Let's skip ahead to the fourth file. You see this is where I made that red limp skate very large. You see that here on this plot that I'm enlarging, right? And then I go back to sample 5 and the rest of them, and the gates all went back to that baseline position, if you will. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm not going to look at the Excel and the PDF because we have a lot more ground to cover today. So let's go back to our webinar outline. Okay, so we've done this. Okay, so let's talk about how to adjust the layout for the batch process with more complex logic. And there I'm going to talk about iterations a little bit more. I'm going to address the question that somebody had in the chat window about what to do if you have a grayed out iterations, how to fix that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And what we can do is we can actually use this same layout that we've already been using. Okay, so like let's talk about the example of iterations getting grayed out. Okay, so when you're setting up a batch process, you only want to have one iteration showing at your layout at any one time. Okay, so here this fulfills that condition. We're only looking at sample 1 on the layout right now. All of the plots show sample 1, and if you're not sure what's going on with your layout, let's say you have many pages or many plots, and it's just too hard to look at each individual plot and see what are they all showing. Okay, what you can do is come over here to the View tab Data Navigator, and let me put this on the right-hand side, and that's going to show you a list of all the data files that are currently showing on your layout. So right now, you see I can verify it's only showing the one data file. And that's why all of my numbers here in the iteration column, which is right here, right, in the lower left-hand corner of my layout where I'm showing the data list. Let me see if I can get my drawing tools to work. Hang on. Nope, it doesn't want to work. I'm sorry. Oh, let's see. No, it doesn't want to. Okay, sorry. But anyway, yeah, these blue numbers here in the data list, I'll just move this out so it's clear what I'm talking about, right? These are all blue. But let's say that, you kind of accidentally or maybe on purpose, maybe you put another file. Whoops, just trying to make a little more room here. Let me zoom out. Okay, so let's say I took this 7th file here and I put a plot of it on my layout, and it doesn't matter. Let's do a density plot. Doesn't matter what we do. So now I have files 1, the files from iteration 1 and 7 showing on my layout, right? So let's maximize this. You can see the file name. Whoops, it's still small. I guess I'll have to zoom back in. Okay, so coming down here, you see this is the file name that ends in 3018. So that's the 7th file right here in my data list. And you can see in the data navigator as well, right? So the data navigator is showing that we have 2 files, 2 different iterations showing in our layout. And now you see that the iteration columns are grayed out. And that's because we're already showing the 7th file here on this plot down here in the bottom, okay? And so we only have iterations 1, 2, and 3 enabled. And that's because whenever you click next on the batch, on the data tab or the batch tab, or when you run a batch process, everything advances stepwise through your iterations, right? So this is already showing iteration 7. When I click next, it's now showing iteration 8. I'm going to have to zoom in because that file name is so tiny. I'm sorry. So you see now this is showing file 44724015 that corresponds to this one here, iteration 8, right? That I'm highlighting in my data list. I click next one more time, and now this is showing iteration 9. It's the 44948035, which is this last file in the data list. And that's why only the first 3 iterations are enabled, because I could only click next 2 more times, right? So if I go back to the beginning, you know, if I can only click next 2 more times, i.e. to 2 and to 3, or in the case of this plot, from 7 to 8 and to 9. And so the way to ameliorate this issue, so you can once again batch through all your iterations, is to either delete that plot, because, you know, most of the time it shouldn't even be there at all, because your batch process was designed to go through all of your plots one by one, to have all the files advanced stepwise, right? But if this was a reference plot or something like that, you know, let's say you just wanted this plot to be here all the time, as some sort of like reference sample or something like that, then there is a way to anchor it. And I'll show you how to do it for this plot, but I really want to show you how to do it for a histogram overlay, because that's probably the more common example, but it's fine. Let's just do it both times. So we're going to go into the formatting menu here. Okay, and go to the overlays category. And you're going to uncheck this box here. This box that's 3rd from the bottom, this checkbox that says change data file during next previous batch, I'm going to uncheck it. Now, do you see as soon as I unchecked it, all the numbers became blue, right, in the iteration column on my data list on the left? So now I can go previous, next and previous in my layout, and do you see, let's zoom back out so I can see a little bit more of what's going on. Just keep your eye on the histogram file name here. Go next and previous, and you see everything's changing just fine, but this one is not, this density plot that we put down here. Okay, so that's how you would anchor a plot in your batch process. Okay, and let me show you the more interesting example, because, like, you know, usually don't just have a spare plot down here that's showing an arbitrary file from your data list, but you might have something like a histogram overlay. So let's do that. So right now we're looking at iteration 2. Let me go back to iteration 1. And let's say that our file from the 5th iteration, this one here, let's say it's some sort of control that we want to anchor in our histogram as a reference overlay. So let me create an overlay, just drag and drop it. Drag and drop the file name onto the histogram, and then you get this question, do you want to replace or do the latter, add the files to the plot as new overlays? So let's do that and say okay. See, once again, now my iterations are grayed out, right? So let's do the same thing I just showed you. Let's anchor this. I don't need this data navigator open anymore. So I'm going to come to overlays, and let's select this second overlay here, and I'm going to uncheck that same box, right? That 3rd checkbox from the bottom that says change data file during next previous batch. I'm going to uncheck it. Keep your eye on the numbers in the iteration column of the data list on the left, right? I'm going to move this around so you know what I'm talking about, because my drawing tools are not working. I apologize for that. So yeah, let's uncheck it. All the numbers. Oops, I unchecked the wrong one, sorry. Okay, let's do that. So yeah, I didn't mean to uncheck that one. So let's uncheck this box right here. Change data file during next previous batch. All the numbers became blue, right, in the iteration column. And now I can once again batch through all my samples, but that histogram is staying stationary, okay? So you know what, let me just turn on some normalization and let me give that histogram overlay a different color just so it's more clear. Okay, we'll give it a gray color, okay? And you know what, let's not show the gate in here, let's just show, in the legend, I wanna just change this back to the file name. Okay, and we'll put in some normalization. This just makes it a little bit easier to see both populations and to compare them. Okay, yeah, it is actually normalized, so that's fine. Okay, so now we could run the batch process. I'm not actually going to do it because we have other things we want to cover, right? But that's how you would handle the different iterations. And I do see quite a few questions popping up. And hopefully I've answered some of them. One person had a question about working with different pages. So yeah, this is a very simple layout, but if you had multiple pages in your layout, which is possible to add, just by using these page tabs down here, you could do that. It doesn't matter, it would work exactly the same. Just make sure that you have one iteration showing on your layout at any one time for the reasons I've just discussed. Okay, so let's go back to our outline. Okay, so we did this, right? We added a control overlay to our histogram. Let's talk about this last example, which is going to be using panels, okay? So this is very cool and it's very flexible. I feel panels, they're used really quite often in clinical and regulated environments and a little bit less often in research environments, but I honestly think that's just because folks don't know about them. So hopefully I can encourage you to try it out with your data files because it makes for a more informative and efficient analysis in a lot of cases, okay? So we're going to use a different layout right now just to keep things interesting. So this has not been converted into a panel yet. Right now, this is just a basic layout, okay? And you can tell because, sorry, I'm just checking, there's some questions popping up and I just want to make sure that I address them. And let me just get these drawing tools to disappear. Okay, so in my data list, you see I have that issue with the grayed out iterations, right? That's because I have 3 different data files showing on my layout right now. So this plot up here is showing the iso.fcs, i.e. the first FCS file in the data list. And then this one down here, it's a histogram overlay, and you can see which data files it has by looking at the legend. It has all 3 data files showing in it, the isotype, the positive, and the sample A. So this is a layout where the objective is to evaluate the staining of this red sample A histogram in reference to the isotype control, which is the gray hatch fill histogram with the low MFI, and the positive control, which is the black filled histogram with the more positive MFI. So sorry, did I misspeak? I meant the isotype control is the low MFI, right, and the positive control is the high MFI. And then we have our sample A, which is the red histogram overlay in the middle, okay? So, okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to erase my drawing tools. Okay, so the question is, how would we batch through this? So before we batch through it, let's state what the objective is of the batch here. So we're not trying to batch through an isotype and then have the plots show then the positive, then the sample. No, we actually want to batch through multiple instances of these 3 files together. So let me quickly put the additional data files into the data list, and then you'll see very shortly how panels ties in. Okay, so I'm going to grab these 3 samples and drag them into the data list. Okay, and so now the objective is to batch through these 3 files. Like this will be one iteration, the isotype, the positive, and the sample A together. And then these 3 files that I'm highlighting will be the second iteration, the isotype, the positive 2, and the sample B together. And this is analogous to the other scenario I described at the beginning of the webinar, where you had 20 mice and 3 different tissue types from each mouse, like blood, lung, spleen, right? Obviously, it doesn't have to be 3. It could be 5. You could have 5 different tissue types, whatever it is. I'm just using 3 as an example. But that's what panels is for, when you need to batch through multiple files in each iteration at a time. Okay, so let's set up the panel, okay? And I think it'll become clear to you. So we're going to come up here to the data tab and click on panels. And I think you can also get that here from the batch tab. It's this multicolored sample tubes together. You can also get it down here at the bottom of your screen where it says no panel is active. Okay, it doesn't matter. So let's take it here from the data tab and click on add to add a panel. And I'll call this my antibody staining evaluation. So you give it some kind of name that makes sense to you. Then put in the number of tubes here. Now the number of tubes is not the number of files in your data list. Okay, and yes, right, samples 5 and 6 are gray. You'll see as soon as I set up the panel, they'll all become blue, just to address the question Roxana had in the chat window. So I'm gonna put in a number of tubes here as 3, because that is the number you want to enter in is the repeating number of tubes that occurs for each iteration. So in our case, each iteration is the sample, that's tube number 1, plus isotype plus positive, okay? So we have 3 different tubes, and I'm just going to follow the order of the data list. If you need to reorder them, I'll show you how to do that in the data list right afterwards. But you want to type in a guide here, because this is what it's going to help you load in your data files in the correct order when you reuse this panel layout in the future as a template. Okay, so you don't have to be super descriptive. It doesn't have to be all drawn out, but give yourself some sort of help or guide that you'll be able to get the tubes in the right order. Okay, so let's click OK. And just click OK again. There's a lot of little OKs to click. So just, whatever is the affirmative choice, click it. So now do you see that FCS Express has organized the tubes into active iterations, which are groups of 3 files, right? So in turquoise, we have the first 3 data files highlighted. That means they're all active. They're from the active iteration. The active iteration means the iteration that's currently showing in plots on the layout. So we have the isotype and the positive and the sample A, right? And they're all matching up to their tube numbers. If you had the tubes or the FCS files coming in a different order that conflicted with how you defined your tube order in the panel, you can just use these up and down carrots, and that will put them in the right order so they match up, okay? Because it comes in an alphanumeric order, and if that's not the way you designed your panel, that's fine. You don't have to redesign your panel. You could just use these reordering buttons here. And look, they have little mouse over hints. So no need to memorize things. You can just hover your mouse over it and it'll give you a hint to what those buttons do. Okay. The other thing I want to emphasize is just like when you're running a regular batch process where you have 1 file per iteration, you want to make sure that you have 1 iteration showing on your layout at any one time. So with the normal batch process, that translated into needing 1 file showing on all your plots at any one time. And if you didn't have that situation, you needed to anchor that overlay. Remember, we anchored the histogram overlay to not participate in the batch by unchecking that box. Same thing here. You want to have only the files from the active iteration showing in your panel. So right now, I only have files 1, 2, and 3. showing on my layout. And remember, I can check by coming to my View tab, Data Navigator, and it's telling me what files are actively showing in my layout. That's a very handy tool if you have lots of pages in your layout, like somebody was asking about in the chat window, okay? So, you know, again, like if let's say I made a mistake and I grabbed accidentally 2 files or, you know, whatever, 1 file from my second iteration and put them onto my layout, you see how the second iteration has been grayed out, right? Because I can't click next because these files are already showing files from the end of the data list, okay? So let's undo that and get rid of those. So now we have, again, just the files from the first iteration showing in my data list. So now I can click next, and did you see the legend text updating to isotype 2, positive 2, and sample b.fcs data files, right? We also have our sample isotype control fluorescence ratio updating up here. And that's just a ratio between, well, we can double click on it and see what it's reporting. So it's reporting the geomean of the isotype 2, the geomean of the sample, which is overlay 3, dividing it by the geomean of overlay 1, which is the isotype 2. Okay, I'm not going to cover like how to set up that statistic. That's more for a statistics type webinar, but you could definitely write to us if you want some help with that. Okay, and if I wanted to set up a batch process right here to export this to PowerPoint, actually one's already set up, so I could run it for you just to show you that it works. Let me just make sure that my file path makes sense. We'll put it on the desktop. Okay. Okay, so I can click run, and this should, oh, I'm sorry, I made the mistake of not starting with iteration 1. So let me start with iteration 1 so I get both of the results coming in my PowerPoint. Click batch run, and we'll have both of these coming out shortly. Okay, I don't think I need to adjust the gates, so I'll say continue. Okay, so we have 2 slides because we have 2 layout pages. I'm sorry, we have 1 layout page in our layout and 2 iterations, right? We had 2 different groups of 3 files. So we have 2 slides, and you see that the batch will work just like it did for a more simple example that we started with at the beginning of the webinar. So hopefully that makes sense. The last thing I want to show you with panels is how you can reuse this as a template, which you can also do for a simple batch layout. We're doing 1-by-1 files. I did show that in the Getting Started webinar last week, so I'm not going to take time and show that today, but the procedure is really quite similar. So let's do this for the panel. So I'm going to say File, Save As, and we'll call it our isotype control layout template. That way I know I'm not going to overwrite this existing file, but I'm going to save a separate copy of it with empty plots that is easily reused as a template. And you want to select here for Save as Type Unlinked. That is the type of file for a template where the plots will come up empty, ready to receive new files. If you're on a PC, this drop-down menu, it won't be called Save as Type, but it'll be here in the file dialog window as well. I think it'll be on the lower right side instead, okay? So let's do that. Wait for my computer to stop doing whatever it's doing in the background. Okay, and we'll do Save. Okay, so let's close and reopen that from my recent docs. So now we have our layout showing as a template. with no data in it, right? So we're going to load in our files into the data list. You can use this little blue plus and navigate to them if you want, or if you already have the files open in your Mac Finder or your Windows Explorer, you can just select them all here. So I'm just going to select all of them at the same time. Yeah, these are the 6 files I want to work with. And by the way, you can work with multiple sets of these 3 files. If you had any multiple of 3, like let's say you had 6 sets of the 3 files, you could load in all 18 here and the batch will work just fine. But for today's webinar, I just have these 2 sets, so I'm just going to load them in. Okay, and so this is a good example of needing to reorder the files, right? Because right now, this is not correct. You see how the histogram is showing isotype 2.fcs and then isotype FCS and positive 2.fcs. We want it instead to be showing the isotype, I'm circling it here, the positive and the sample that all go together. And the reason it's not showing the correct files is because it's loaded in all the files according to alphanumeric order. Okay, that's just how the files are loaded by the software. So let's talk about how we can reorder the files. So remember I mentioned it's these little up and down carrots, right? And they're going to allow us to move the files up and down. So I'm going to move isotype up here. Sample A should go up here. And positive should go up here. And did you notice as I'm doing it that the histogram overlays are updating? So that shows that the panel is automatically sending the files from the correct tubes to the layout, right? To the correct spot on the layout. Okay, so that looks correct. And then this is isotype 2, positive 2, sample B. That's all matching up the descriptions in the tube, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. And I guess one thing I can show you since we're talking about panels, you know, this is showing the file name and the legend, but you can also format the legend to, instead of showing the file name, and so of course you want to make sure legend is checked off here under visible, right? And then you go to overlays and select all these 3, and then maybe in addition to the file name, or maybe instead, let's do instead. No, let's do in addition, okay? So we can come down here and put tube number. Okay, so now it's telling me the tube number as I've named it in the panel. Maybe I want to delete tube number and put in the tube name. Okay, so now right after the file name, it's putting in the tube name. And let's get rid of the file name actually. And then we could do something like this, put the file name after the tube name. So that looks like it makes a little more sense, right? That's more nicely labeled, okay? So the panels, I hope I've convinced you to give it a try. There's lots of examples where panels are useful. Let's say you're doing an antibody titration. So this is just an antibody evaluation of staining, right? But let's say you're actually doing like a multi-point titration with serial dilutions. Let's say you're doing a hybridoma screen and you're screening every clone from your hybridoma with 5 different serial dilutions and then checking it against a positive control or negative control. So let's say you had the 5 serial dilutions plus 1 control. That would be a panel of 6 tubes. And then however many iterations you have in your data list, so this iteration column would be however many hybridoma clones that you have to analyze. And the panel would really help you analyze those more efficiently. And then you can use other features in FCS Express to enhance your analysis, like the scatter with regression plots, where you could put in a quantitative, Michaelis-Menten curve and really evaluate how much antibody to use from each different clone based on the Vmax of that curve. You can automate your analysis and it can be quantitative and efficient. And, that's just one example. There's maybe you're doing a time course experiment, where you're checking a drug library, and every drug you're testing, 5 concentrations plus 2 time points. That could be a panel of 10 tubes, right? With multiple iterations, and the iterations would equal how many drugs you're screening from your library. So it's really unlimited, and it's a very powerful tool. And hopefully we'll do a webinar even more in depth about panels in the future. But this webinar was intended to just basically help you get an idea of all of the things that the batch process can do for you. And so using panels is one of those, and hopefully I've given you a taste of that, as well as how to handle troubleshooting your iterations when they get grayed out. And so that would be either removing the extraneous plots or unchecking that change data file during next previous batch, which would effectively anchor that plot during your batch process to allow all the other plots to advance stepwise through all your iterations and restore all the numbers in the iteration column to blue from gray, right? So, and most of all, I hope that I've helped you understand the concept of iterations, because that's really the foundation of the batch process, no matter how simple or complex your particular batch process is. So thank you so much for joining us. As usual, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel and our videos website. Within a couple of days, you'll get an automatic follow-up email with a link to those websites so you can review this webinar at your leisure. And if you'd like some help with any of this, because you're trying it on your own and you run into some kind of roadblock, or you just wanted to discuss some elements of your layout with us and get some software help, just write to us at support@denovosoftware.com. We have very good support. Our response is guaranteed within 24 hours, but we usually reply much sooner, probably within a couple of hours in most cases. And also avail yourself of our help. So if you have your startup screen, you can click on help and manual here, and that will take you to our manual website. I think if you're on a Mac, though, it'll open up a PDF. So another way to get to the help, which I prefer when I'm on a Mac, is go to the File tab, Help, and click on Tutorials, and that'll bring you to our website here, which I feel is easier to search than the PDF. And then you can, for instance, type in the word panels. Sorry, it's so small. And then click search. And then you'll have all of these results coming up, which are relevant to what you need. Okay. And also another useful item here is if you click here on video guide. If you're on a PC, this will launch a floating window that has a bank of short 2 to 3 minute videos that are very topical. So for instance, there'll be a video about panels, a video about batching. If you're on a Mac, it's going to open up in a browser just like it has for me right now. And if that's the case, you should just scroll down to short overviews, and you can find, for instance, this 3-minute video about batch processing, and there should be one about panels. If I scroll down, yeah, this one here called Using Panels. That's a 3-minute video about how to set up a panel. So feel free to use that if you want to refresh your memory. Okay. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us again. Oops. And I will be sticking around on the line to answer any questions. So feel free to enter those into the chat window. And I see Raphael's done a great job of addressing most of those. If there are any we couldn't get to, we will be following up with you after the webinar. Just give us a couple of days because we have quite a few. And thank you all for participating. It really makes it more fun for us too when we get all your questions in real time.